I greet you all. I want us to talk about advanced internet programming, since this is what we shall be covering this semester. There are a number of things that I would want us to be mindful of, and so we want to try and address them. To start with, when we are doing our course this semester, we shall be using these tools, but not limited to this. There will come a time when we shall install other tools, but for now, we shall be using JDK, using version 8 for demonstration. I'll also be teaming it up with NetBeans IDE 8.2. I'll use Apache and Glasgow, and then I'll also use PHP as we go on. In case of need to install any other tool, we shall do so as we go in. We all know that JDK is a Java development kit, so it will enable us to run Java programming programs. We know that we cannot install NetBeans IDE without the Java development kit. And so that means as you install your application, make sure that you have installed JDK first, then you install NetBeans. But also you want to test that to be sure that it is running. It can actually read the Java files, so you want to go and set your system variables to be sure that you are actually able to read and execute Java applications. We shall be using Tomcat and Glasgow as the servers. These are open source web servers, and so we shall be using them. In the long run, as we proceed, we may decide to have our own server, our own database, and then we connect to it, but we shall see that as we go. So what are web applications? If we are talking internet programming, then definitely we are talking about web applications. When we talk about web, certainly we are talking about applications that are going to be deployed, solutions or software that is going to be deployed on a certain server. Now this server may be this open source server, or you may have your own server, but the gist of it is that we should be having this software deployed on a server and then accessed online. When we say it's going to be accessed online, that means we shall need a web browser to access this. There are various web browsers that you can use. You can use Explorer, you can use Mozilla, you can use Chrome, and all others that you can find. The bottom line is it a browser? As long as it's a browser, then it can help us to tap into our server and we are able to access our software. So when we are talking about these types of web applications, we are talking about intertwining technologies, web technologies. And so we are going to be seeing different technologies coming into play to enable us achieve this web application running up and accessible and able to do what it is that we want to do. And so understanding these different technologies, we shall be using them as we go on. We shall be using NetBeans as an IDE since it produces or it provides a number of features that we can use in the development process. And so that means that we have no option but to install NetBeans. I know that this won't be a problem since you have used it in Java programming, that is OOP, so I'm sure you are comfortable with the environment. Now, when we are talking about internet-based applications, there are two basic kinds of projects that we shall find in NetBeans. And we shall find a web project, but we shall also find enterprise application projects. When I say web project, I'm talking about the Java web projects, but there are also enterprise application projects in NetBeans. Now, web projects basically run on a web server, such as Tomcat. So that means in there we see a number of servlet containers. A number of servlets are stored in there. You have done web programming, so you understand what servlets are. We find a number of servlets in the container Tomcat. But enterprise applications, we find EJB. EJB is the enterprise Java Bean components. And so this needs a different kind of server, not Tomcat. So if we are doing a web application, we are good with Tomcat server. But if we're doing an enterprise application, then we go and use the Glassfish in NetBeans. And so you find that this also brings up different perspectives of what will this application look like, what kind of resources will it use. And so now that means if one is not really just doing this for academia, as one is trying to use NetBeans, you want to be sure what kind of application am I going to build, so that you're not wasting resources, you're not using more than you need in your particular project. So you want to come up with something that not only works, but also saves on resources. And so you find different server scripting technologies like Spring, which we shall see shortly as we start to use our NetBeans to come up with these applications. You'll find application servers like Glassfish. And so we open both servlets, JSP, and EJBs, and so on. Like I said, all these will become clearer as we use them, as we talk more about them in implementation. Application servers are clearly heavier. So that means you do not want to be using, to be having Glassfish included in your application, yet you are actually going to just do a web application and not an enterprise application. So you do not want to have a lot of weight in terms of resources, and yet you do not need that kind of resource. So choosing the right server for your particular type of application also does help to know how this will be hosted on the internet. And so the other thing is how these projects are termed. The web is WAR, and then the enterprise is R. And so we are talking about web for W for web, and then E for enterprise. And so we have all these repository files coming together as we create them. Definitely as we store them, they have, or they require an extension. Just the way you save a Java file, you give it a .java extension. The same way when you're saving these kinds of applications, you want to give them an extension, so that when you're trying to open them up, your operating system knows what to use to actually open up your application. Now, we also have, we also are supposed to be mindful of the kind of layout or the parts that we are going to find as we work with our applications. If we are talking about our web application, typically you find it into three parts: the front tier, the middle tier, and the database tier. And that means you have a back end, you have a front end, you have a middle part, a connecting part. And so in looking at this, starting with the front end, you find that you're doing more or less forms that form interfaces that are going to require your users to interact with your system. And so that means you are thinking of coming up with pages which have all these CSS, the JavaScript, the HTML, because what you are actually doing, you're doing client-side scripting so that you make these applications as user-friendly and convenient as possible. So that means you're going to use all these other tools that can make these forms appealing, but also usable by your client. And so we claim that is the frontier. But once we have that, then we also want to be mindful of the middle tier. What is this that is going to connect the two? Before we even get there, you're thinking you need a database where all this data, all this information is going to be deposited. And so that is when we start thinking about the actual databases. I know that you have studied databases, so you should be comfortable with this. So if we are talking about our databases, then it's up to you to really decide what kind of database are you going to use. But of course, you want to come up with a database that does complement the kind of scripting language that you are trying to use. So if we have our backend, maybe you are using Oracle, maybe you are using SQL Server, maybe you are using MySQL, whatever database that you may choose to use. At the end of the day, we expect that in here, we are simply seeing the kind of information or more or less a repository of the data. But then if I have this end or say a container with all this information, how am I going to have this interface, which I've called the frontier, connect to the back end, which I'm calling the database tier? And so that is where the middle tier comes in. And so here we see a lot of business logic. How is this being done? How does the application behave? How is it processing this information? When it receives this data from the user, how does it behave? How is it connecting? And so we see all these responses and requests being managed by our middle tier. And so we see these can be done in Java. And so we can use things like servlets, the Java beans, the EJB, and so on. So that means ideally what we're saying is that the middle tier has a lot of programming to enable us have what we actually expect the system to take on and look and leave out what we do not want. So that means any kind of validation, any kind of tuning, any kind of processing that you really require to do, most of these logic statements will be made up by your middle tier. But apart from that, when we talk server, then we start to talk about the Glassfish and the Tomcat. And so you want to think about this really in line of Oracle. The Oracle platform gives us these as open source servers. And so that means one can use them for any of their application because they're open source, you're not going to pay for them. And so that means you're going to be able to download them. And so these are developed by the Apache Software Foundation. You realize later we'll be talking about the Apache NetBeans. When we get to that point, we may have to download another component or a plugin. But nonetheless, for now, what I need us to understand is that when we think about using a server, when we think about using this kind of repository for now, we shall be using either the Glassfish or the Tomcat for this application. So that means I need us to do our installations. I also want to make mention that as we install our NetBeans IDE, please, during the installation, there is a point where you are asked to select a server. Please check the Tomcat server so that it's also included in your IDE so that we don't have to struggle to install it later.